Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Maureen Taylor, the photo detective, and my guest today is John Woods Sweet. And I am incredibly excited about this. We haven't done a blast from the past in months and months and months, mostly because they're really hard to coordinate. But John is here today. If you have not read The Sewing Girl's Tale, A Story of Crime and Consequences in Revolutionary America, you should. It is a model of what you can do with nonfiction. It's fabulous. So we've got like just a couple of people here right now. But John, since we last spoke, you were on episode 198 of the podcast, the Photo Detective Podcast, if anyone needs more content. Your book, which when we talked, I was like, this has got to win an award. I mean, it's just too good. And in fact, I mean, if there was a Triple Crown for books, you would have won it. New York Times Editor's Choice, winner of the Bancroft Prize, Francis Parkman Prize winner. I mean, come on. Winner of the Gotham Book Prize, the New York Society Library's New York City Book Award, and the Journal of the American Revolution named it a Book of the Year. Anything else hanging out there?
The book just won the Biography Award of the Society of Historians for the Early American Republic, wonderful group known as SHEAR.
But I mean, you know, as far as historical prizes go, I mean, the Bancroft and the Parkman, I mean,
big ones, yeah.
Those are huge.
Yeah, Bancroft was one of the first.
Yeah, so let's start by, actually, now that I've praised your book, let's talk a little bit about who you are and where you sort of where you work and what you do. And then I'd really love for you to talk about what the Bancroft Prize is and what the Parkman Prize is, just in case anyone doesn't know.
Yeah, I'm an American historian. I teach at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I teach mostly early American transatlantic history. For example, I teach regularly the transatlantic slave trade. And my early work was on the history of colonialism and slavery and freedom struggles in New England, in the North, but mostly New England. And I'm returning to that topic now with a book on Venture Smith, who was the author of the first American slave narrative and lived in New England most of his life, New York State technically, and New England.
And we met when you were here in Providence working on your PhD.
Yeah, I grew up in New England. I went to college at Amherst. I did my graduate work in Princeton, and I spent a lot of my time in graduate school living in Providence, and that's where I met you, Maureen. We were both working on projects on runaway notices in newspapers, notices not just for people escaping from slavery, but also people escaping other forms of servitude, and also people running away from prison and
running away from husbands.
Charges, husbands, mostly husbands, sometimes
mostly husbands, a couple of wives. Yeah, that was a long time ago. Yeah,
20 years ago.
Yeah,
30.
We can talk about that. Maybe more than that. It could be way more than that. But anyway, tell us a little bit about what the Bancroft Prize is and what the Parkman Prize is and why this is so significant.
Well, I did my best to convince the people in charge of my salary that these were significant.
They are significant.
So there's that. The Bancroft is, often regarded as the most important prize for American historians. And this year was split 3 ways with 2 other wonderful books. And it's funny, they asked me what it meant at the time of the award presentation, and I was like, it's fundamentally a relief. You spend so long working on a book like this. I was telling Maureen earlier, I spent 10 years in this book, and I'm like, no, actually, if you look at an actual calendar, it was 15. And you never really know when you're working on a book if you're going to, if you're making the right decisions, if things are going to come together in the end, or if it's just going to be a mess, whether anybody's going to find anything of value in it. So anytime readers, I love, meeting with book groups. book clubs. And anybody who's read the book and found something positive in it or something of value in it is always really just incredibly gratifying to me. Because
Yeah. So give us a synopsis of the book.
so the book is based on the first published rape trial in American history, which was a trial that took place in New York City in the fall of 1793. And it's really very similar to, has a lot of resonance with modern acquaintance rape or date rapes. And the story is told from the point of view of Ilana Sawyer, who was the survivor in this case. And I went to a lot of effort to make sure that the book wouldn't be about the rape itself, that this was a book about how this remarkable 17-year-old working class woman responded to what had happened to her, and how she kind of recovered physically and emotionally, how she pursued recourse, how she rallied her family and then legal officials behind her, how the case was argued, and then the whole series of tumultuous events that happened after the trial, the rape trial, was concluded.
And you found, I mean, people will say, oh, how could you possibly have told this story? But in fact, you found a cache of records and then recreated the community in which she lived.
Yeah, I really admire your work on photographs. A common link is kind of this very fine-grained, in my profession we call it microhistory, but it's, very much overlaps with genealogy, in which, I did a lot of genealogical research for this project and consulted with some really expert genealogists when I was afraid I was missing something. Because I wanted to know, where did Lana live? Who were her parents? What kind of family background did she have? Where did she get the chutzpah to stand up for herself the way she did? So that kind of research, as you know, Maureen, can take a lot of time, because you're looking not just for somebody who was a soldier in the revolution, but this particular soldier in the revolution. And that can be a lot harder to find. Sometimes you can't find it.
Well, it can be very hard to find. It can be very hard to find. So, I mean, anybody have any questions for John? You can pop them into the chat, the post on Facebook or on YouTube, and we'll see it. But how do you even begin? And I know that a lot of colleagues in my field struggle with, how do you organize your thoughts and your research around this huge topic? I mean, how do you manage it? How do you decide what? Do you make a timeline? Do you make sort of a calendar of documents? I mean, what's your sort of work method for this? Because you really did recreate a part of New York, naming specific people, talking about their lives, talking about the history of their families, and often cases. It's intense research.
Yeah. So one thing I did, I'll just for the record, one thing I tried to do was find out where everybody lived, and that required, figuring out what information I could get about people's addresses in 1793 from tax records, and then translating those records into modern locations, because New York City's street names have changed, numbering systems have changed. And so that was a really meticulous process, where some places were pretty easy, some places were really hard, where you had to it was like brute force password cracking. You just try this one, try this one, try this one. So there was a lot of research like that took a lot of time and persistence, not really much brain power, but a lot of effort. But keeping track of it was really central. And I use a variety of tools to keep track of different kinds of research. I'll tell you, the first thing I do is I look up, every once in a while, I search the internet for what young historians, the bright young things, are doing in terms of their digital humanities workflow. But I use a bibliographical database to store notes in, called EndNote. I use a writing platform called Scrivener, which I like because it lets me break big writing projects up into tiny little pieces and kind of keep them all organized. That follows a dictum from Annie Lamott, the great writing expert, novelist and writing expert, called, she says, bird by bird, buddy. Do it bird by bird. I use a kind of mind mapping software called Scapel. I'm actually was just this morning working on a Scapel, trying to organize the pieces of part of this Venture Smith project, where I'm telling the story of when he ran away from slavery in 1754 and trying to figure out what are all the elements, what do we know from other sources. So I did a lot of trying to visualize and map what I was trying to write. And then, of course, you write something and it's too long, and then you try and figure out what is the element in it that's most valuable for readers. So for me, it's a long process.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear about your tools. I have several colleagues who use Scrivener. I've kind of played around with it, but it is about using the tool that helps figure out how your brain works, like which one matches your brain. And Scapel I've never heard of, but I'm going to have to look at it.
Scapel's made by the same people as Scrivener.
Oh, okay. I'll have to do that. And you set out with this book to do something a little bit different. You told me in the interview on the podcast that you actually met with an author, a fiction author.
Oh yeah, I had a really all right. So two things about this book that were different for me, really an experiment for me, was I really wanted to figure out how to write, or see if I could write, narrative history. And I was, I was talking to this famous editor. And the first version of this project, I sent a proposal to her. Her name is Susan Rabiner. She's a wonderful editor, agent, long-standing editor, and now an agent. And she's like, oh man, I called her and she's like, John, this is this is not a story. You said you were trying to write a story. This is not a story. This happened, then this happened, then this happened, then this happened. That's a collection of things that happened. That's not a story. So I knew early on that I had a long way to go. And I presented actually several different versions of the project to her. And so partly was trying to figure out how to tell a story where the action is driven by the motivations of the characters, and the characters develop over the course of the book in the same way that a novel does. And yet you're limited by what is true from the historical record. So that's why this big research net I cast in order to collect all kinds of random debris, so I could hopefully find the pieces that would be useful for telling the story, moving the story forward, and helping to understand what emotionally was going on with these characters at different points in the story. And I'll tell you, the second version of this book I presented to Susan Rabiner, this agent. She's like, John, I see you're working. She's like, call me. I called her. She's like, John, I see you're working on telling a story. And this is kind of a story, but it's a horrible story. Nobody wants to read the story. Try again. So I was depressed for a year and then tried again. So yeah, part of it is the challenge of technically, how do you tell a story? And then how do you tell a story that is communicating what you want to communicate? After she said, this is a horrible story, I'm like, well, yeah, I composed that because it was a logical story, but it wasn't really the story I wanted to tell, much less the story any reader would, want to read.
But for the most part, as historians, we're taught the first version. This happened, then this happened, then this happened, then this happened, right?
Yeah, and then you have some explanation.
Yeah.
And then
a lot of footnotes.
Why it matters.
Yeah.
One of the big helps for this project was a wonderful historian called Katie Simpson Smith, who keeps publishing amazing books. One of them last year was The Everlasting. A couple of her books were historical, about early American Southern history. She just has a book on a pair of botanists working at the Colosseum in Rome, which is just completely fascinating. It came out this spring. But she was a former graduate student in our program here at UNC. So she was a historian, a PhD in history, who had decided she just wanted to be a novelist instead, and has been very successful. Anyway, she agreed to help read the manuscript, and I've had a whole lot of productive conversations with her. And when she read the draft that she read, I learned a lot from her. The book improved, and I learned a lot, because there's a moment of one big moment she really wanted me to dwell on was the main character attempts suicide, and it's kind of succumbing to despair at a certain point. And the way that was set up, she's like, well, this is set up in a way that's effective, but you just tell us that and then move on. And it's shocking to the reader. The reader needs you to, hold their hand a little bit and let that sink in and emotionally process that. And that was something as an historian that I never really thought about, was like, not to be rude, but the needs of the reader, like, oh, there's a reader out there and they have needs. Who knew? And Katie was really smart about that. She was very skilled at being like, this is where the reader needs to hear from you, that you have the same question in your mind that they have in their mind, that you haven't forgotten, that you're on it, that you're going to circle, you're making a promise, you're going to circle back to something, if you can't deliver it at the moment. So she had incredible instincts about that. And also she was super smart about the question of narrative. She pointed out at one point, in a way that really crystallized one of the themes of the book for me, was that the whole book is about storytelling. There's the me trying to tell the story. But then the story is also like a contest over truth in the legal sphere and the public, in the newspapers. Different versions of the truth are being presented. Different versions of who Lana Sawyer is are being contested repeatedly in court, and then also in the newspapers. Lana Sawyer herself, after this, at the beginning of the book, after this assault, is really disoriented and by this assault, and traumatized. And part of that is making sense of what had happened when you trust a man and you think that he's one person and turns out to be another person, and thinks he has one set of intentions, and you have kind of a script in your mind of what's going to happen. Mm-hmm. And then something else happens and it's horrible. That really shakes your sense of reality, your sense that you understand, you accurately are perceiving the world around you and people around you. And that, to recover from that, involves this whole process of taking those pieces of events that happened that don't make sense and integrating them into a narrative of your life that does make sense for you.
This book, and the reason I like it so much, is because you give us the narrative story, which, I'm sure you and I could have a conversation about good narrative nonfiction we've read and some that really don't make it, but try. And it grabs you, and her story grabs you. Her personality, the way you've portrayed her grabs you, and you give us those suspenseful moments that are part of every great thriller. Mm-hmm. You give us that, and you give us data, and you don't get ever lost in the data. I don't think you get lost in the data. You give us a lot of data. We're geologists in this little sphere here. We deal with data. That's what we do. So, it's always maybe not too. We never say, oh, we have too much data. We're always out there looking for more.
I think in the final book, it came out okay. I think
It came
there were
out,
years there when I was lost in a sea of data.
of course, because how could you not be? You had poured over newspapers, court records,
Right.
the maps, the city directories, trying to create an incredible, complicated story of not just one woman's life, but the society in which she lived and her parents.
Right.
I mean, nobody ever does that.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it was really, I got really intrigued. So I must say, most of this book was written because I was curious. And there were a lot of places where I didn't know much about the specific characters. And in order to make the story function, I had to think about their motivations and what they had at stake in the story. Like, the assault takes place in a brothel run by this woman named Mother Carey. Um, and I've learned various things about Mother Carey, but not enough to really understand what it meant to be a brothel keeper in New York in 1793, or
Mhm.
what the place of prostitution was in New York in 1793. And it was a huge business. Much, it's hard. I say to students like, oh, prostitution was much bigger in the 18th century than it is now. And they're like, yeah, really? But what about OnlyFans? And you're like, all right, well, that's a whole new world.
Whole nother thing, right?
It's a whole different world. But if you just stop at 2000. Um, so, so I did the best I could to research the business of prostitution in this period and how people talked about prostitution and what her financial and legal risks, her financial strategies were, and what her legal risks were. Um, and it was fascinating because historians are really divided over what prostitution meant in the late 18th century.
So here's the thing. You are writing about average people,
Hmm.
not the rich.
Right. Well, there are some rich people, but
There are some rich people, and they're right. The ne'er-do-well rich people for the most part. But uh, the common thought is unless someone's rich, you're not going to be able to find any records on them. And your book just takes that and just destroys it.
yeah, it turns out that, yeah, like, I found the gravestone of this madam, who was, her brothel was destroyed in riots and she was forced to flee New York, and but she turned back up in Philadelphia. Um, and so she actually left a lot of money in her will, and the thing she really wanted was a big white marble gravestone with her name on it. So she's buried in the same graveyard as Benjamin Franklin with exactly the same stone. Um,
Amazing.
so yeah, it's amazing what you can find. And in some ways, this book is, certainly I reached my limits, where I couldn't find any, I was waiting. I wanted to find out something and I couldn't find it out. But I feel really fortunate by all that I could find out.
Does anyone have any questions for John about his book or about his research process? I'm not sure how many of you have read it. I know someone will share a link. Maybe Caitlin has the link. She can share it. But when we talk about the importance of the Bancroft Prize and the Parkman Prize, name some of the people in the past that have won the Bancroft. There's a ton of them. I mean, like tip of your tongue historians. So I'll just do a little quick search, which I should have done before I got on. So many of them. You're in great company. If anyone's looking for like a reading list, like sometimes I like to do that, like create a reading.
For example, my college advisor, Robert Gross, won the Bancroft Prize in 1976 for his classic book on the revolution called The Minutemen and Their World, which is one of the books that really started the movement towards kind of the new social cultural history in America.
Oh, that's an amazing book.
So that was one example.
That's on my bookshelf. Definitely. Actually, the Bancroft Prize is not so easy to research because they've done one of these sites where it's all the heads of the authors.
That's all the people.
Not my favorite way to look at a website. God, you've got every year they award a new one. So you could This is Bancroft Press. That's why I'm in the
Uh,
wrong place. Bancroft Prize winners. So who would you? Yeah. So we've got the other two that you shared the prize with were Bad Mexicans, Race, Empire, and Revolution in the
Yeah.
Borderlands,
Hell,
and
yeah,
G-Man, J. Edgar Hoover in the Making of the American Century.
so books that people would remember are things like David Blight's biography of Frederick Douglass won
Yep.
the Bancroft Prize.
Yep.
Heather Thompson's Pulitzer Prize winning book, Blood in the Water, about the Attica prison uprising, won the Bancroft Prize.
So if when you were putting this together and you were thinking this is what you wanted to do, were there books that you read that helped you define exactly what you meant by narrative nonfiction?
Yeah, there were a lot of books I read for inspiration and models. One of my favorite is Candace Millard's book, Destiny of the Republic, which is a book about the assassination of President Garfield in the 1880s. And I was just listening to, I read that a couple times. And every time I look at that book, I'm like, oh my God, she's such a genius. That was, I think, her first really well-known book. And for me, it's still the best. Where she's tracing the assassin and Garfield's, both of their kind of trajectories towards each other. And then the aftermath, because Garfield doesn't die immediately. He gets infected because surgeons refuse to use antiseptic methods. But the beginning of that book starts in the fog of Long Island Sound as these two steamer ships heading in opposite directions, the Narragansett and the Stonington, collide into each other in the middle of a night. And her assassin is on board and is one of the survivors of the ship, which explodes and then burns. And most of the passengers on it died, but a small number disembark at Stonington after being rescued. And she has a great line where she says, she's trying to evoke a sense of just how crazy this eventual assassin would be. And she says, almost everybody who got off the ship and survived, felt lucky. They felt fortunate. They felt so relieved. And she says, not this guy. Garneau felt when he came off with a certain knowledge that he had been chosen.
Oh, that's great.
I'm
quite fond of a historian, Paul Collins, literary detective.
Yeah, and
he hasn't written anything in a while, but God, his books are riveting.
And he had a one that I read about a trial that mentions the Bedloe trial. It was the Manhattan Well murder trial. So it was a trial about 8 years later, in which the attorneys refer to the Bedloe trial, which was called Duel of something.
Yeah, I've got that on the bookshelf.
Another book I really love that you might like is Kate Summerscale's The Suspicions of Mr. Witcher, which is Victorian era. It's about one of the first detectives in the London police force, by which we mean one of the first police detectives anywhere in the world. And this crazy case that kind of nearly was a sensational murder case in the country house. It's a very kind of Agatha Christie style murder a century earlier. And it's about his investigation of that and then how it's beautifully, beautifully written. She's such a good writer.
That's my list.
He kind of reached his struggles to solve the case kind of drive him kind of crazy and also threaten his career. So it's kind of how this crime threatens to undo the master detective. He's a character that he's a real historical figure that Dickens based characters on, and Wilkie Collins as well.
Yeah.
I think
there's so many. We'll create a list, and if you're on my newsletter list, which you should be if you're watching this, we'll send it out as a sort of reading list of narrative nonfiction that's not to be missed. Anybody have any questions for John? We're just about at the point where we're going to wrap it up, and John, you and I need to catch up later. because we
Yeah.
have loose ends of the project. Any questions for John about anything, process, book, other things you've read? Anything at all? Somebody ordered a copy of your book. Somebody said they
Yeah.
had Scrapple.
Let me do my one piece of show and tell.
Oh yeah, that's right. Do your piece of show and tell.
So, talking about the craziness of the world, every once in a while I was working on this book, I would research the names of all the attorneys and everybody involved to see I'd just Google them to see what would turn up. And at one point, the name Caleb Briggs showed up on a rare book website. And Caleb Briggs was, so when Lana and her father went to file charges against the rapist, they went first to a private attorney, which was a really interesting thing for them to do, for a working class family to know to do that. And they did that to kind of control the paper trail. Anyway, the attorney was Caleb Briggs. And the main legal text that he would have consulted while talking to Lana and hearing her story and then crafting the criminal complaint to present to the magistrates would have been Blackstone's Commentaries on Laws of England, Volume 4. And it turned out that was for sale. And so, I don't know, where's my camera? So I bought, my screen's backwards. I bought Caleb Briggs's copy of Volume 4 of Blackstone's Commentaries on Law of England, which has the passages on sexual assault. So this was a student edition. He was a young attorney, just entered the bar. So this was a London 1786 edition. So I have no doubt that this is the copy that was in his office when Lana was there consulting with him. It's like the only thing in the world I know of where she was in the room with this object, with this book, which then proved
she was actually in the room with that book.
I'm pretty confident that this is his book, and it would have been in his office, and it would have been the book he needed to do the work he was doing for her. That was amazing. So they were like, we want $50 for it. I'm like, I'll pay you $50.
I'll pay you $500 for it. So are you still doing those searches just to see what pops up?
I was actually in touch with a kind of great nephew of the perpetrator this summer, which was kind of fun. And yeah, it's interesting.
And were they aware?
He was very charming, a retired attorney who is named after Bedloe's father. And the rapist is named Harry Bedloe. And sorry about that. And he, so he knew that this was kind of a black sheep in the family, but it was also, 200 years ago. So who really cares? But he said that it wasn't until he read the book that he realized what a black sheep Harry Bedloe was, what a creep he was, and how lucky he was that he got the father's name, not Harry's name.
Not the other name.
But yeah, everybody, I've met a couple people who are descended from different sides. Some of the attorneys, people have shown me family portraits on the photo detective side. I've seen 2 different portraits of Bedloe's attorneys, still owned by family members, which is kind of cool.
That's amazing. I think that's the fascinating part for me, is the stuff that's still in families that gets passed down.
Yeah. It's wild.
Yeah, it's crazy stuff. John Wood Sweet, I want to thank you so much for being on Blast from the Past. We haven't done one of these in a while, but you're certainly a great guest for this. What are you working on now? You said Venture.
I'm working on Venture Smith, who was a man enslaved in Connecticut and on Fisher's Island, New York, which is just off of the coast of Stonington in New London, and was born in Africa, secured his freedom in the 1760s. His son served in the Revolution, and he wrote in the late 1790s a really fascinating autobiography, both about his African childhood and his experiences in North America, and kind of calling out the continuing problem of racism in the new American Republic. So, as you know from my earlier work, that's right up my alley. I do kind of feel like I'm coming home to that project.
So are we going to have to wait 15 years?
I hope not.
I really hope not. I hope not. I'm hoping this whole process with the Sewing Girl's Tale has gotten you through that sort of.
Well, I've been working with
beginning
Benjamin Smith a long time, and I feel like I'm ready. So there you
Okay,
go.
great.
Thank you so much, Maureen.
Sure. Thank you. Have a great rest of the day.
Thank you.
Bye. Oops. Gotta hit the right button.